Hello, my name is Daniel, and today I'll be talking about video games, and in particular video game violence and how it affects the real world. Most of us in real life, we all play video games. It's a widespread idea, but there's a lot of people that are worried about how it affects, particularly little children, under 5 years old, and how it affects us growing up. So my point of view is that violent video games have a negligible effect on real world violence. And I'm going to prove it to you by explaining how the violent crime rates in the US have been decreasing as video game companies are gaining popularity. My second point would be that the studies done on video game violence are hugely flawed and it doesn't show a strong connection at all. My third point is that from a statistical point of view, just because there's a correlation between violence in video games and violence in real life doesn't mean that it's the direct cause of it. And finally, I will end up with that video games aren't meant to agitate people. They're supposed to reduce stress. Beginning with my first point, the crime rates in the US have been decreasing since 1994 to 2014. Crime rates have been decreasing about half. Youth violence or acts of violence like hitting and beating people up have been reduced by 30%, and murders have been reduced by 70%, whereas the video game industry has almost tripled in the last 2 decades. And this also brings to the point that other countries in the world, such as Japan, the Ukraine, Australia, they also have really big game industries, but their crime rates are also really low. So the crime rates, it doesn't just apply to the US that high crime or the lowering crime rates have a connection. My second point is that the studies done on video game violence on youths are flawed. Most of these studies begin with a group of participants come in, they play either a violent video game or a neutral game, and then after that they either discuss about how they feel or they ask the participants to punish another person by saying how much hot sauce you should give to someone, assuming that they didn't want or they don't like spicy food. And then although it says that people are more likely to be cynical and evil, it's because of the mood. After playing a competitive or a violent game, you're in that mood, so it doesn't really, you can't really say it has a connection to, because the results are right after, so there has to be a big time to evaluate the effects. Another connection is that people can tell or differentiate real life and video games as early as the age of 3. So just because little kids play violent video games doesn't mean that they will directly copy it in the real world. And then the responses that people give after from surveys and studies, they're mostly qualitative. So they explain their feelings but it's not really concrete numbers. The video games they played were this violent, and afterwards they felt that they were this violent afterwards. My third point is that the correlation between video games doesn't mean that the cause of violent acts in real life are because of the violent video games. Most of us here has played video games, but that doesn't mean that we will commit violent acts in the future. We're not all going to become mass murderers because we play violent video games, even though some of us have played more or some of us has played less. And then there are different causes for real-life violence too, such as like family issues. Some people are more stressed, depressed, so they turn to violent video games in order to like calm them down. And this goes into my final point of how video games are meant to calm people down and not or calm them down in order for them to not do violent acts in real life, because when they play video games, it lowers the stress. They use it to relax and vent out their frustration that they can't do in real life. And based on those points, I would like to conclude that violent video games, they only have a small, minuscule effect on real life violence.
Right, Daniel, the proposition's clearly stated. There's a good preview, so it's structured well. It's going to be easy for us to follow. I think you did a good job on that. You explained the assumptions on each of your supporting ideas and points, so you're doing a good job trying to build some credibility there. What's missing, though, is any citation of information in the presentation. You assert that crime rates have gone down between '94 and 2014. I don't really doubt that, but I think you need to give us some source on that. You suggest that youth violence is down by 30% and that murders are down by 70%. That should be easy to document. If it's FBI crime statistics, cite the FBI crime statistics. That's the closest that you come to citing a source of evidence in your information. After this, there is not a single source citation for any of the points that you're making. You've got explanations of the arguments that you're making, and you give reasons, but there's no grounds for the argument that you're presenting. On the second point, where you're claiming that the studies are flawed, you even try to describe some of the studies, and I'm not sure that the studies are very clearly described. I'm still not sure what the hot sauce has to do with anything, but the idea is that you're suggesting that these studies in some way are not representative of violence in society or the games themselves. And who arrived at that conclusion? You, based on your reading of these studies? Or are there critics of these studies who also are responsible for doing research? Is this a professional evaluation from peers who have responded to the studies that have been reported on in the journals? Or is it just gamers who are looking for some way to pick at this information because they don't have any information of their own to support their point of view? I don't know, because there's not any source citation in the presentation, so that's a little bit problematic. The idea that correlation is not causation, you explain that okay. You refer to people's personal experiences. That's about as far as it goes there. So we've got kind of a personal example, hypothetical example that we're dealing with here. And the idea that video games are primarily to calm people down or something along those lines. I am not a gamer, so I don't know. However, everybody that I know who is a gamer, who plays these things, calm is not the way you would describe them when they're playing the games. So I think that you need to have some information there because it seems to be counter to my expectations about what's going on. All right. I thought you did a good job speaking to the audience for the most part. You're a little dry. I think you need a little bit of energy sometimes, but that's just practice. That's just one of those things. Like you can relax in a little situation sometimes and get into it. But I thought you did a good job looking at us and talking to us. Thank you.